Hello, and welcome to the History Inquirer. That's where we inquire into the past to understand our present. Today's episode will cover the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse and its impact on the rest of the war. Our inquiry questions are: what were the causes and effects of the battle? Who fought it? What are the details of the battle itself? So sit back, grab a snack, and drink if you want, and let's get started. The year was 1778. In May of that year, British General Henry Clinton received orders to evacuate Philadelphia and pursue a defensive strategy around New York City. This change in strategy was due to the French joining the war effort, as well as the British belief that the southern colonies were a weak point that they could exploit. They begin with Georgia, South Carolina, and then move north into North Carolina and Virginia. So, starting May 25th, the evacuation of Philadelphia began, with lots of the troops leaving on June 15th. General Clinton and his men moved overland instead of by sea due to lack of transports. This worked in favor of the Americans because the British Army would be vulnerable during the march north. General Washington, after convening a war council, decided to send 5,000 troops to attack Clinton's rear guard, which they should outnumber, as this was not the main force. Washington initially offered the command of the attacking force to Charles Lee, his second in command, but he turned it down. Later, though, he was persuaded to reconsider so as not to lose face. General Charles Lee led his men against the rear guard of Clinton's army on June 28th near Monmouth Courthouse, now Freehold, New Jersey, which was commanded by General Charles Cornwallis. Lee tried to outflank and surround the smaller British force, around 500 to 2,000 men, by dividing his forces in two. However, Generals Clinton and Cornwallis saw the Americans coming and called for reinforcements. Now the British had 10,000 men versus the 5,000 Americans. As historian Woody Holton writes, Washington had hoped his 5,000-man detachment would isolate an enemy contingent half its size, but that was precisely the advantage that Clinton and Cornwallis now enjoyed. As a result of this, Lee would be forced to retreat and reorganize his men in a defensive position while he waited for Washington's main army to back him up. Unfortunately for him, his men retreated on their own, humiliating him in front of Washington, who rode up in time to see his retrained professional soldiers running before the enemy. The other issue at play was the weather. As Woody Holton writes, the mercury rose over 100 degrees on June 28th, killing about 60 soldiers on each side, which was nearly as many as enemy fire. Artillerymen had the most punishing job of all, working a cannon, hoisting a shot or shell and a sack of gunpowder into its white-hot barrel, ramming them home, dashing for cover as the gun's discharge rolled it 4 or 5 feet backward, then dragging it back into position before swabbing the barrel in preparation for the next shot was hot work, even in winter, and actual torture on a day like this. Joseph Martin, who was there during the battle, mentions in his memoir that the field of battle felt little better than the mouth of a heated oven. When the artillery crews began withdrawing to the shade of the trees to provide some relief from the heat, some of the other soldiers thought that order to retreat had been given and followed suit. The only thing that General Lee and his officers could do was to prevent retreat from becoming a rout by organizing and imposing order on it. So basically, it was like a domino effect. One group sees the other group withdrawing and thinks it's a retreat, and so they retreat, and then the next group sees that and starts retreating, and so on and so forth. Now, due to the training under Baron von Steuben, the majority of the men were able to turn around and form a defensive line on a hill and continue fighting. They were able to run and then turn around and fire, which is a Prussian tactic. When Washington rode up, saw his men retreating, the enemy advancing, and learned that the order to retreat had supposedly come from Charles Lee, he was outraged, livid even. Washington publicly abused him, questioning his commitment to an attack that he had opposed in council, and reportedly even calling him a coward. Though we use a different word than that, use some expletives too, but yeah, basically called him a coward. And now this was not entirely Lee's fault, but Washington believed that it was, since General Lee had overseen the attacking force. Nevertheless, Lee was removed from command, with half his troops being given to General Mad Anthony Wayne, and behind him in reserve, the other half under the command of the Marquis de Lafayette. General Nathaniel Greene commanded the right flank, and General William Alexander commanded the left. Now, before I continue with the rest of the battle, I do want to point out an incident concerning Washington when he came on the scene that Joseph Plum Martin writes about. He writes that after passing us, he rode on the plain field and took an observation of the advancing enemy. He remained there some time upon his old English charger, while a shot from the British artillery were rending up the earth all around him. After he had taken a view of the enemy, he returned and ordered the two Connecticut brigades to make a stand at a fence, in order to keep the enemy in check, while the artillery and other troops crossed the aforementioned defile. I personally like that Simmons and Washington sitting calmly on his horse as bullets of artillery shells fly around him while he observes the enemy and organizes his men. I like that. As for the battle itself, the British attacked the American right and were pushed back. They attacked again in the center and were pushed back, with both sides gaining and giving ground back and forth in a tug of war through the afternoon. The artillery took center stage during the fighting, what became the largest artillery duel of the war. Joseph Plum Martin gives us an account of another incident that he observed during the battle. He writes, "One little incident happened during the heat of the cannonade, which I was eyewitness to, in which I think we ought be unpardonable not to mention. A woman whose husband belonged to the artillery, and who was then attached to a piece in the engagement, attended with her husband at the piece the whole time. While in the act of reaching for a cartridge and having one of her feet as far from the other as she could step, a cannon shot from the enemy passed directly between her legs without doing any other damage than carrying away all the lower part of her petticoat. Looking at it with apparent unconcern, she observed that it was lucky it did not pass a little higher, for in that case it might have carried away someone else and ended her occupation." Historian Woody Holton also writes about this and another woman who took over a musket from her husband. He says, "Martin's anecdote may have been fanciful, but Dr. Albigen's Waldo, who helped treat the Monmouth wounded, heard that after one infantryman was shot down, his wife took over his musket and, like a Spartan heroine, fought with astonishing bravery. discharging the piece with as much regularity as any other soldier present. In the 19th century, Martin's and Waldo's accounts would coalesce into the story of the far less bellicose Molly Pitcher, who brought pitchers of water to cool her husband's cannon and slake its crew's thirst. Molly Pitcher must be understood as a myth, not because no fallen Continental soldier's wife ever took over for him, but because so many did. I love these stories. I really do. Because they add color to the narrative and paint a more meaningful picture of what happened. They add depth, character, richness, soul, etc. Around 6 p.m., the battle ended in a stalemate, with both sides exhausted from the fighting and the heat. Both sides suffered around the same number of casualties, 500 men or so. The British, after a rest, would slip away under cover of darkness around midnight and continued their journey north to New York. Both sides would claim victory since the British had achieved their aim of reaching New York and the Americans held the field of battle. The Americans had also proved themselves during the battle that they could go toe-to-toe against the British army and hold their own, and even win. The relentless training and drilling during the winter at Valley Forge paid off. The battle was also a victory for Washington because it enabled him, after a court-martial, to rid himself of Charles Lee. As Woody Holton writes, the commander-in-chief helped draft a 3-point indictment alleging that Lee had disobeyed orders to attack, issued his own unnecessary order to retreat, and what Lee could not deny, responded to Washington's battlefield rebuke with a pair of insulting letters. The panel found him guilty on all 3 charges and suspended him for 1 year. That drew him into a dispute with Congress, which made the suspension permanent. Here was another sense in which Washington won the Battle of Monmouth. He rid himself as a second command who had become a liability. Washington would move his army north to White Plains, New York, where they would skirmish with British forces in conjunction with the French fleet around the region, including Newport, Rhode Island. One of my sources says that Washington put his men in kind of a semicircle around New York, so he could cover the country, basically cover all his bases. However, they could not effectively siege and conquer New York City without a much larger force. That was kind of Washington's dream, which was to mount a grand assault on New York City and take it and end the war right there. They were not. See, the problem was the French had bigger priorities in the Caribbean, and they were not able to come together to take the British stronghold in New York City or recruit enough men. So it was, despite the combined American and French forces, that General Cornwallis was able to take a force down to Charlestown, South Carolina, take the city, and attempt to take the colony before moving north to take the rest. Thus, the war that began in the north would end in the south. But that is a video for another time. Thank you all for watching. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you next time on History Inquire. And remember, keep inquiring. Thank you.